In the same way that indie developers have gravitated towards genres that allow for more randomization and reuse of assets, a similar homogenization has taken place in the AAA space as well. The single-minded obsession with extending a game's runtime at any cost has led to many big studios rallying around the same genre, the open-world RPG, filled with menus, resource gathering, menus, item crafting, menus, and menus. Whether you're coming up with a whole new setting, resurrecting an old franchise, or creating the latest entry in the longest-running series in gaming, it seems to go without saying today that these features are non-negotiable. You will play the 60-hour game padded with filler and copy-pasted content, and you will like it. The argument that you'll most often hear in defense of this kind of design is that it creates an immersive, unbroken space that the player can explore and get lost in. And I mean, on the surface that seems like a very reasonable and respectable goal for a virtual world to have. This goal of immersion is the altar that your patience and your precious time are sacrificed to when you invest in completing one of these games. But in practice, the way it's implemented in most games rarely, if ever, actually has the intended effect, and any sense of immersion or realism cracks under the pressure of the abstract and repetitive gameplay loops placed on top of it. When enemies respawn indefinitely, resources exist in infinite amounts, and you can waste as much time as you like doing side missions before advancing the main narrative at your leisure, the eventual conclusion the player has to come to is that nothing they do really matters, and the only control they have is in choosing which order to deal with the to-do list on the map screen. And with all that in mind, Cyberpunk 2077 is in many ways the quintessential AAA game. It's got celebrity casting, which means that the devs need to take away control every once in a while so they can show off the famous faces in extended close-up cutscenes. It's got a big map covered in markers for copy-pasted side content to inflate the runtime at minimal development cost. It's got inventory management that forces you into a menu a few times every hour without actually presenting any meaningful choices, another great technique for inflating the runtime. And it's got a lifeless open world that forces you to look at the map every time you want to choose a destination, and then makes you stare at a tiny radar in the corner of the screen until you reach it several tedious minutes later. And yes, this is probably the greatest runtime inflating trick of them all. Now I can hear you rolling your eyes. Yeah, here we go again. Yet another video where I spend an hour complaining about open worlds being deliberately designed to waste your time. The irony is not lost on me, believe me. And what can I say? I'm guilty as charged. You haven't heard the last of me complaining about open worlds in this script. But as with most games that are worth discussing, or spending a month of my life making a video about, there's a brightly burning glimmer of potential in what Cyberpunk brings to the table. And while I came away from the experience somewhat underwhelmed, there was enough there to keep me playing to the end, about 80 hours all told. And while the average open world game is only able to muster 12 hours of unique content to stretch over its 80-hour skeleton, the ratio of worthwhile ventures to time-leeching slop is a lot better in Cyberpunk than in any similar game I could care to mention. This is due in large part to the surprising depth of the Immersive Sim mechanics, and the vast number of moving parts that make up any given encounter or mission. The usual blend of stealth and combat that you've come to expect from modern games is alive and well in Cyberpunk, and there's a hell of a lot of customization and build choice that can genuinely change your options and affect the way you approach problems. While I found the combat quite dull, and would even sometimes load a save to avoid having to take part in it, the vast number of possibilities available to the player using stealth kept me engaged from start to finish, and carried my interest more than any other element of gameplay. When I think back to the positive experiences I had with Cyberpunk, it's this complexity and stealth mechanics that comes to mind first, and to the game's credit, I spent a good chunk of my playthrough in that mode, using a toolset I had devised and customized myself to solve problems that were never quite the same twice. When I think of what I was doing for the other half of that playthrough, it becomes a lot more of a mixed bag. The story is hit and miss, and while I did grow fond of one or two characters by the end, the plot feels totally lacking in consequences, and it never actually has any impact on the gameplay. Combat isn't great, so it's a good thing that it can be mostly avoided, and thankfully the occasional set piece or forced boss fight tend to spice it up enough to make it more interesting. To my pleasant surprise, the RPG mechanics and skill options do succeed in adding more depth and customization than in most games where you're allowed to unlock everything eventually, but the weight limit and the inventory management system seem to have been tacked on carelessly, with no respect whatsoever for the player's time. As for the open world, I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear that my thoughts are largely negative. In a way, Cyberpunk suffers from the opposite problem to Red Dead Redemption 2. When you're inside a mission environment, you have a huge amount of freedom in how you accomplish your goals, but in the open world outside of those missions, there's nothing to do but press the go button and watch the number representing the distance to your objective tick down. And all of this is to say nothing of the poorly rendered elephant in the room that is the notoriously sorry state that Cyberpunk released in back in 2020. I'm not letting the devs off the hook for that, but as someone who bought the game on sale and played it in 2024 after several years of patches, my experience was presumably about as close to the intended one as it's possible to get, and I trust you'll agree that critiquing that intended experience will lead to a far more interesting discussion than just showing you a list of glitches I saw. That said, I don't want to ignore that part of the game's history, and perhaps more importantly what it reveals about the industry as a whole, so I'll return to it later when appropriate. All in all, I find it difficult to say whether I would recommend Cyberpunk or not. I genuinely enjoyed the immersive sim aspects, though they're not without their flaws, but what's harder to forgive is that they're wrapped in layers and layers of fluff, all of which is of questionable value, and I can't stop myself from thinking that maybe you should save yourself 50 hours and just play Deus Ex instead. But another part of me thinks that I'm selling Cyberpunk short, as it clearly has high ambitions and was aiming to be something more, or at least something different, and the promise of a game that lets the player loose as a criminal element in a futuristic sci-fi city is one whose appeal should need no explanation. Sadly, for the most part, Cyberpunk falls well short of those lofty ambitions, but I will always respect the attempt, and I don't want to discourage any prospective future developers from trying their hand at something similar. For my part, all I can do with the remainder of this video is try to explain where exactly I think Cyberpunk does and doesn't work, and how it might have lived up to the truly massive amount of potential hidden inside. Decide for yourself whether you want to play the game before watching more, because there will be spoilers from here. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that Cyberpunk takes place in the year 2077, but it's not really speculative sci-fi in the usual sense, which attempts to present a plausible vision of our own future. Instead, it's more of an alt history setting that diverges from our own timeline in the late 20th century. The USA suffered an economic collapse, the Soviet Union survived, and Japan took over as a world superpower. This may well have been conceivable in 1988 when the tabletop game responsible for the setting was written, but it doesn't really fly today, and it comes off as a kind of farcical retrofuturism. If this is what the devs were going for, then fine. But it puts a limit on how much the setting is able to say about the actual world we live in today, which, in my very humble opinion, is the entire point of sci-fi, or at least it's the reason I find myself returning to the genre again and again. But anyway, putting the outdated geopolitics of the setting to one side, it nevertheless manages to hit on the usual cyberpunk themes of nihilistic individualism, dystopian corporate greed, and transhumanism. And these are the elements of 1980s futurism that still ring true today. The fact that this 40-year-old satire of corporatism hasn't lost its relevance is something I leave you to reach your own conclusions about. Night City sits on the Pacific coast of North America, as a free state independent of any higher authority or government. It's a neoliberal's wet dream where everything is privatized, from healthcare to transport to policing. Poverty, homelessness, and gang violence coexist right next door to the highly concentrated wealth of big business, protected by private militias and all too happy to squeeze what they can from an addicted and desperate population. The one thing all parties seem to agree on is that life is cheap. Some thought was put into how language might evolve over time, and though some of the neologisms used by the people of 2077 might raise an eyebrow at first, it grows on you quickly, and actually becomes a pretty nova part of the experience.
Take me for a fucking gonk.
The extent to which the player can take part in this cyberpunk fantasy depends on which element we're talking about. You can suit yourself up in ultra-modern clothing and ride around metallic plazas in futuristic vehicles, and I'm certainly no expert in fashion or engineering, but I find most of the designs quite believable. You can walk into a shady chop shop and get your cybernetic eyeballs replaced with better ones, along with any other organ or limb you're bored of, and the choices made here are genuinely meaningful once you get into a mission environment. I'll get to that later. But you can't, for instance, get yourself a private healthcare subscription with Trauma Team to come and save you if you lose all your health, presumably because that would allow the player to rely on a paramilitary to get them out of any difficult situation. Now that I think about it, for a setting in which we're supposed to believe that money means everything, there's actually remarkably little you can do with it, and no reason whatsoever for the player to care about it. Expensive vehicles and preem apartments are the only big ticket items you might want to splurge on, both of which are completely inessential, and I purchased them mostly just to stop my 6-figure stack of eddies from growing another digit. To be clear, I'm not saying the game would suddenly improve if you could pay a private company to complete missions for you, or if you had to make regular rent payments to avoid going homeless. My point is that in terms of open world systems the player can interact with, Cyberpunk isn't much more than a trimmed down and chromed up GTA clone. While Red Dead 2 feels like its systems were designed around creating a believable simulation of 1899, Cyberpunk's commitment to the year 2077 and to its corporatist setting feels mainly cosmetic. Because it is. However pretty those cosmetics are, they don't make up for a lack of meaningful interactions with the world. Perhaps the ultimate demonstration of this is that there are flying cars in this setting, but the player is never allowed to drive one, only to look at them. They're nothing more than set dressing, a cheap trick meant to wow the player. In the end, I have no choice but to conclude that the sci-fi setting of Cyberpunk is seriously lacking in the charm that was present in The Witcher, and it just doesn't quite capture the imagination in the same way. And I say this as someone who vastly prefers sci-fi over fantasy. Okay, so if the setting is only skin deep, then at least it can serve as a nice looking backdrop to a good story, right? Well, taken in isolation, I think the story is okay. It's not great, but it's not bad either, and it mostly succeeds at serving up plausible justification for all the sneaking, shooting, stealing, and killing the player is expected to do. It also brings the player into contact with a sizable cast of supporting characters, most of whom have their own things going on with a bit more depth than your average NPC, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't grow at least a little bit attached to some of them by the end. Sadly, the protagonist I was supposed to be embodying was not one of those characters. That protagonist, of a gender and appearance of the player's choosing, is the mercenary V, presumably so named to make recording the other characters' voice lines cheaper. You can choose between 3 different origin stories for V, which dictates what the first 30 minutes of the game look like before you're railroaded onto the same path anyway. Your choice of backstory will also unlock certain dialogue choices throughout your playthrough, but it's nothing game-changing. I have a few more thoughts about these extra dialogue options, which I'll get to when I'm talking about gameplay later. For now, just know that the player has freedom of choice in creating their character, which means that by necessity, V is more of a blank slate than Geralt was in The Witcher. What this means, necessity or not, is that V is a dull and uninteresting, if not outright unlikable character, little more than an empty vessel used to introduce the player to the cast of NPCs that will be bossing them around and putting markers on their map. This can be seen most starkly in the excruciatingly awkward scenes that play out if you ever choose to invite your chooms over to hang out in one of your apartments. You can sit down and trade a couple of lines of pointless dialogue, give your virtual girlfriend a kiss, dance in complete silence, and that's about it. I hope this is obvious to everyone watching this, but this is a very poor imitation of what hanging out with your friends tends to look like. In all honesty, I'm not sure what could have improved these embarrassing dates, and it may simply be the case that games aren't quite ready to try simulating personal relationships in this player-initiated way. In the more scripted environment of a linear set of missions, dialogue, banter, and development can be dished out by the devs at an appropriate rate. Not so much when the socializing steering wheel is handed to the player. But enough about the lack of character in the main character. What does the actual story look like? Well, whichever background you choose for V, the intro will soon force you to become best friends with Jackie Wells, and eventually to pull off a heist together to clep an experimental biochip from the Arasaka Corporation, the most powerful entity in Night City. Mid-robbery, you witness some office politics you weren't supposed to see, and as you try to delta out of there, Jackie dies, the biochip ends up inside V's head, and they're left for dead before being rescued by a rebellious element within Arasaka. Although this botched heist can happen 6 or 7 hours into the game depending on how much side content you do first, it's the real inciting incident of Cyberpunk's story, and everything afterwards follows on from it. The upshot is that the biochip now plugged into V's skull contains the memories and personality of one Johnny Silverhand, a rocker, contrarian, and all-around edgelord who died blowing up Arasaka 50 years ago, but now lives again rent-free in V's head. The downside of this is that the biochip, which can't be removed, is slowly overwriting V's brain with Silverhands, so the remainder of the story concerns V's race against time to save themselves from having their body snatched. I guess all of this was the dev's solution for how to make Keanu Reeves the main character in a first-person game while still getting to put his face on the screen in every cutscene. I won't waste time in going through every little thing that happens after this, because as I see it, the real purpose of it all is just to give the player a reason to interact with other characters and get involved in their separate stories. Suffice to say that V follows various leads around Night City, killing gonks and gaining intel on their predicament, usually aided by a different companion who will have their own story you can advance with side missions later. Some of these companions present opportunities for friendship or intimacy, and I think the romantic scenes were handled quite tastefully. They're not played purely for titillation, or at least the main story ones aren't.
You looking for some company tonight?
Every now and then a main mission will end with a scripted sequence where V coughs up blood to remind you that there's supposed to be some urgency to the plot. Eventually it all culminates in an assault on the corpos at Arasaka HQ, either alone or with the allies of your choice. In the end it turns out the promised cure doesn't exist, and there is no happy ending waiting for V. The player can choose between willingly letting Johnny take over, destroying the chip at the cost of a 6-month lifespan, or allowing Arasaka to digitize and upload their mind to a library just like they did to Johnny 50 years ago. Either way, it's the end of the line for V. The exact options you can pick between in any given ending depend on who you chose to ally with for the final assault, meaning it doesn't entirely come down to which button you choose to press at the end, but it's not far from it. I didn't much care for V and wasn't particularly bothered what happened to them, but I did stop to think how other characters would be affected by my decisions, so at the very least the story managed to wring some empathy out of me at the end here. I should mention that the DLC adds a new area to the map, a few new characters to meet with stories of their own and some choices to make, including a couple of new endings along the same lines as the ones I've mentioned, but I don't think it adds anything truly different that wasn't present in the base game. That's partly why I was so disappointed by it, but I'll save my more detailed thoughts on the missed potential of the DLC for a later section. Across all of Cyberpunk's story, my main criticism of it is that it's totally devoid of any consequences whatsoever outside of scripted sequences. It doesn't matter if you kill a powerful gang leader, hijack essential city infrastructure, or end a mission as the most wanted criminal in Night City. It will all instantly be forgotten once you're back out in the open world. Narrative cause and effect are indefinitely paused, and you can waste time or do whatever side missions you want until you choose to press play again. Likewise, you can watch V coughing up blood and philosophizing with Johnny in cutscenes until the bioengineered milk-producing bovoids come home, but it changes absolutely nothing about the way the player interacts with the game. None of it is real, and the stakes are completely illusionary. Just like the rest of the setting, the story is only for show. All of this creates a profound disconnect between the player and V that's impossible to reconcile. Am I supposed to take their plight seriously, or am I supposed to take it as just one attraction among many on the Cyberpunk content carousel? Rather than actually embodying V and the frankly terrifying situation they find themselves in a way the player is just another indifferent passenger in their head like Johnny, and I think it's no wonder that I never came to care for them. Okay, I hear you cry, so the story and the setting are nothing but set dressing. But for the love of all things chrome, what are they the set dressing to? Well, that's what I'll get into in the next section about gameplay, where thankfully my thoughts are a bit more positive. When it comes to gameplay, there are two halves to Cyberpunk. The parts that take place in enclosed spaces, and the parts which take place in the open world, with occasional bleeding between the two. When you get into the closed environment of a mission, either main or optional, the Immersive Sim half takes over, and you're free to accomplish your goals in any way you like, with whatever tools you chose to equip yourself with beforehand. These are the most enjoyable parts of Cyberpunk by far, and I'm pleased to be able to say that a significant percentage of the game looks like this, especially if you complete every side mission. The other half of the gameplay takes place in the open world, and to put it bluntly, is a huge waste of time. but I'll get to that in the next section, because I want to talk about something positive for a while before launching into the usual tirade against open worlds. Like any immersive sim, the thing that really makes Cyberpunk's gameplay tick is choice and consequence. This goes for build and loadout choices made before starting a mission, and for the more immediate second-to-second choices made while you're actually on the ground. When you visit a cyberware chop shop in between missions, you can kit yourself out with gear and mods that add various abilities to your moveset, and crucially, you have a limited number of slots that you can fill for each body part. For instance, you can only equip one leg mod, so you have to make a calculated decision between a double jump, a faster sprint, quieter movement, or a charge jump for covering large distances. You can only pick one, so the trade-off you choose to make here is meaningful, and it dictates the options that will be available to you when you're in a mission later. Same goes for every other upgradable body part too, and you always have to think carefully about how to fill your limited number of slots to best complement the way you want to play. In the very early hours of a playthrough, there will also be a financial component to this customization, as you won't be able to afford something for every slot, but this becomes irrelevant sooner or later once you have enough money to never think about it again. While there are a few upgrades that only change percentages like crit chances and damage values, which I don't find particularly interesting, there are enough options here that add genuinely new abilities to make it a worthwhile system, and on the whole, it gives the player plenty of meaningful decisions to make. But that's not all. In addition to these cyberware mods, the player has another avenue of customization in the skill trees and perks that become available as you gain more XP and level up. Again, there's a mixture here of boring perks that do nothing but modify percentages by tiny amounts, and more interesting ones that add new options to your moveset, like a mid-air dash, a sprint while crouching, or the ability to block bullets with a bladed weapon. Your level caps at 60, so you can't unlock everything and need to prioritize what you think is important, just like with cyberware. But one key difference with this leveling system is that it can be opened from anywhere and at any time, unlike the chop shops that can only be visited between missions. What this means is that you can save upgrade points to spend any time you like, and in fact it's a sensible strategy to keep a few unspent points going spare in case, say, you come across a trapdoor that you need one more strength level to open. You can just open the menu and bulk up with the button press to get through it. Thanks to this, there's less strategy and forward planning involved in choosing what to level up compared to the cyberware upgrades. Rather than being a choice you have to make before a mission and then improvise around, you can change your stats on the fly in reaction to what you encounter on a mission, and I find it a less interesting system to engage with as a result. Okay, so the stuff I've covered so far is the higher level decisions that the player makes through menus and upgrades, but the other side of any immersive sim is the interactions made possible by the moment-to-moment gameplay, and that's what I'll move on to now. When the player arrives at any given mission location, the enemies will be unaware of you, so you immediately have a choice to make between utilizing stealth or entering open combat, although sadly, only one of these options is enjoyable or mentally stimulating to engage with. If the player opts to stay undetected, they have to take into account enemy patrols and security systems while navigating the environment in the safest way to reach their objective, often making use of climbing and verticality to avoid sightlines. This is one area where your chosen cyberware upgrades can make a lot of difference in the options available to you. One thing I realised while writing this script that I think deserves a lot of praise is that there are barely any vents in Cyberpunk. In many immersive sims, vents are a way for the devs to unsubtly signal to the player, "Look here, there's a stealth route." It feels contrived, it gets repetitive quickly, and it's a lazy way of adding options to the game when all it really asks of the player is to press the crouch button. In Cyberpunk, these shortcuts aren't present, and you need to actually use your head to find a way through a room of enemies. It's free-form problem-solving at its best, and while you can get access to some tools I'll mention later that are a bit too overpowered and break stealth, there's nevertheless something endlessly compelling about sneaking into somewhere you're not supposed to be and escaping without raising the alarm. If you do get detected or deliberately enter combat, however, the possibility space narrows considerably, and the player has far fewer options at their disposal. There are stuns you can cast by interfering with an enemy's cyberware, but your choices mostly come down to which weapon you want to have equipped while you empty magazine after magazine into spongy enemy skulls. Cyberpunk suffers from the usual open world problem of having enemy levels scale up alongside yours, making the whole numbers game into a pointless exercise. Thankfully, the perks that add genuinely new abilities to your moveset mean that it's still worth leveling up. Combat is far more stat-based than stealth is, and I would occasionally come up against a mini-boss who I simply couldn't beat before they rushed me down and drained all my health. I ended up cheesing this one by repeatedly baiting her into a long climbing animation. I'll concede that my problems with combat might come down to personal preference and build choices, and it's possible that you can have a better time with it if you equip yourself with different cyberware, but all I can say is that I never found it very interesting in my playthrough. Periodic exceptions were in main bosses that had more varied movesets than just walking towards you and shooting you, and using my own abilities to respond to their unique moves was a lot more engaging than fighting standard grunts. As I've said, if you choose to engage with all the side missions, then you can spend a lot of time enjoying the Immersive Sim, solving problems with whatever toolset you wish, and I appreciate the freedom the player is given in their approach to side missions in particular, which tend to just give you a location and objective and then ask you to figure out the details by yourself. These objectives tend to be stuff like assassinating a target, rescuing someone, stealing data from a terminal, uploading a virus. You get the idea. Get in, do the thing, get back out, with the exact specifics left in the player's hands. Clearly, an attempt was made to give some kind of narrative justification for each side gig or cyber-psycho breakdown, and there are reams of text to scroll through if you want the full background on each one. But, to put it mildly, I'm skeptical that this is really the best way to do incidental storytelling in an interactive medium. Before long, I started skimming and then ignoring the text entirely without feeling like I was missing out on anything worthwhile, especially because V usually gives a helpful summary in a message to the gig fixer after the fact. Is this more a problem with me than the game? Possibly, but I hope you can agree that there's got to be a more engaging way to tell a story in a game than by just giving the player paragraphs of text to crawl through. While the freedom present in side gigs is there in some main story missions as well, I find something irritating about the way they beat you over the head with painstakingly long explanations of all the different options you have. Of course I have the option of getting into this building however I please. That's the entire point of the game, and it should really be allowed to speak for itself, as it does in the side gigs. Just to really make sure you don't miss it, these options are sometimes even plastered on the screen as objectives, as if you weren't just talking about it with a companion character 10 seconds ago. What's the point of planning things ahead of time if you're going to be given step-by-step instructions to follow anyway? I have a big problem with the game's overuse of objective markers and waypoints, but since I see that as an issue that grows out of the open world structure, I'll save it for the next section. To give you an idea of just how much freedom the devs were willing to leave in the player's hands, there was one side gig that I was able to complete in around 10 seconds, breaking in through an upper story window and immediately headshotting the target from stealth, before jumping back outside and disappearing into the night. I don't have a problem with the short length of this mission because I know it's mostly just luck that I happened to climb in the right window, and there's a good mixture of simple gigs like this and more elaborate ones. I did have a problem, however, with the final side contract in the Haywood district, which also took 10 seconds but was totally linear and didn't involve any interesting choices. I went down some stairs, talked to a guy, picked up the goods, and went back upstairs. That was it. I have to wonder if I accidentally skipped a more interesting resolution to this contract by choosing an overpowered dialogue option, which leads me to my thoughts on the dialogue system and its shortcomings. It's very simplistic and just consists of choosing an option from a list, and there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself, but a problem emerges when you start to notice a pattern in how these options work. Some dialogue is unique to your chosen background for V, or requires a certain skill level, and the game tells you this with a little icon on the option to make you think that your choices are making a difference somehow. But the thing is, whenever you see a special dialogue option like this, you can be reasonably sure that it will guarantee you success at whatever you're trying to accomplish, and in that way, these options and icons trivialize the conversation or persuasion you would otherwise have to pull off. This may well make for suitable role-playing for your character, but it doesn't exactly result in an interesting decision for the player, and I would sometimes choose a dialogue option before I even read what it said, based solely on the icon next to it that I knew would guarantee success. Bizarrely, you can still see potential dialogue options grayed out even if you don't have a high enough skill to use them, which has the hilarious side effect of letting you pause the game mid-dialogue, level yourself up to the required number, and then pick the option that was blocked off seconds ago. How's that for meaningful dialogue choices? Now I'm starting to veer towards my more critical thoughts on Cyberpunk's gameplay, and I'm going to start drawing comparisons to games that I think accomplish similar goals in a much better way. Actually, mostly just to one game that still stands at the top of its class, Deus Ex. Which, by the way, isn't an open world game. Maybe that will be relevant later, who knows. Let's kick things off with stealth, which I've praised as the highlight of Cyberpunk. I stand by that statement, and I enjoyed it enough to go out of my way to complete every side mission, but it's undeniable that it has its flaws. First off, it's way too easy to disable security cameras and turrets. All you need to do is look at them. You can even disable a camera that's in the process of detecting you. The resource you use to remotely hack items like this is RAM, which recharges quite rapidly over time, and you might already be starting to see why this is a problem. What this means is that hacking is essentially a free action that costs you nothing, as long as you're willing to wait a few seconds for the RAM to recharge. If cameras were only disabled for a short amount of time, or if RAM was a limited resource that didn't automatically get restored, or if enemies actually reacted to a device being disabled right in front of their eyes, then this whole mechanic could have been a lot more interesting and there might have been some actual decision making for the player to do. As it is currently, it costs the player nothing, and so it's a total no-brainer to disable every device you see as soon as you're in range. And what's more, it's effortless to pull off. For an extreme example to really prove my point here, consider the field of proximity mines dotted around the farm at the end of the kidnapping investigation quest with River. Any player with a sufficient amount of patience and a sufficient lack of respect for their own time can sit here and disarm each and every mine to maximize their XP gains before moving on, and I know that somewhere out there at least one person did that. When the optimal way to play is as boring and time wasting as this, you need to rethink the way resources work in your game. Okay, are you ready for your first comparison to Deus Ex? In that game, hacking and lockpicking actually require the use of a limited resource that doesn't magically regenerate, and is therefore a meaningful decision. Using up a hacking tool on a device obviously means not having it for future devices you may come across, so every problem you encounter comes with a natural incentive to try and solve it using as few resources as possible. If you can get past a camera without having to hack it, you'll be in a better position for future encounters, so expending some of your very limited supply of tools is usually a solution of last resort. Now returning to Cyberpunk, just ask yourself this: is there any reason not to hack this camera? The answer to that question tells you all you need to know. Sticking to the topic of stealth for a moment, the ease with which you can hack devices isn't the only exploitable feature. Though I'm no fan of the combat, at least there's some variety in the level of threat posed by different enemies, depending on their health values and equipped weapon. In stealth, every enemy and even some mini-bosses, no matter how heavily armoured they are, can be taken down with exactly the same action by sneaking behind them, with the very rare exception of the occasional mini-boss in a mech suit. When grabbing an enemy, you always have an option between a stealth kill or a non-lethal takedown, but I never actually noticed any difference between these two choices. Perhaps there's some missed potential here. Maybe bigger or more armoured enemies could only be taken down with a loud and deadly manoeuvre, which could make nearby goons suspicious or even contribute to their faction disliking you more in the open world, though I'm getting well ahead of myself with that suggestion. I also want to point out that there's something to be said for the way stealth knockouts work in classics like Deus Ex and Thief. You get yourself behind an enemy and use the same attack button as always. In Cyberpunk and in the newer Deus Ex sequels, this previously intuitive action is detached from the usual controls into a context-sensitive button prompt, and I don't really see the point of this needless abstraction. One final thought on stealth. There's a cyberware mod available at chop shops called Optical Camo, and if you get this installed, then sneaking is even further trivialized. Just like the RAM used for hacking, the camo recharges back automatically, so you can use your brief window of invisibility to get into a safe hiding spot and then just wait a minute to rinse and repeat. Again, what's missing here is some kind of limited resource to turn this into an actually meaningful decision. Let's move on to another thing Cyberpunk stumbles on that Deus Ex got right a quarter of a century ago. As we've already seen, certain doors and gates can be unlocked or forced open if the player has enough points invested in the relevant skill. But what this often means is that the player can completely skip entire areas or sidestep potentially interesting problems with a single button press. If you've leveled up your strength enough to get through this door and skip this room of enemies, your reward is that you have less game to play, and it's maddening to me that the devs couldn't see the problem with this. Compare again to Deus Ex, where investing in stronger arms means you can move heavier objects, but you still need to interact with them and apply some brain power to solve problems or reach high areas. It's not as simple as a lock you open by having a certain level. In a true immersive sim that lets you select your own toolset and gives you multiple ways to interact with the world, any given room might look completely different to two players who had chosen different skill sets. If you've chosen to make yourself strong enough to move large objects, then the way you interpret the interactive possibilities of a space full of large objects will be completely different to a player without that ability. On a deep mechanical level, Deus Ex becomes a radically different experience depending on your choices. In Cyberpunk, your skill investments will let you open this door and make the game end faster. And I haven't even got started on the inventory system yet. The inventory in Cyberpunk adds a stupid amount of menu usage to the game that wastes your time and weighs everything down without adding any interesting decisions. The inventory limit is big enough that you'll never have an issue carrying everything you actually want to carry, so there are no real trade-offs to be made about how to equip yourself, and you'll be able to pick up everything you see for a few hours before getting over-encumbered. But because there is a limit you'll eventually reach, you're forced periodically to pause the game and empty out all of the crap you've been dragging around. Mercifully, you don't need to carry all of this clutter to a merchant in order to offload it. In the inventory menu, you can convert unwanted weapons and other junk into so-called components which don't have a weight and can be carried in infinite amounts, and you'll need to do this every few hours each time it fills up. So again, I ask you, what interesting decisions does the weight limit add to the game? There are none. It adds only busywork and tedium. I had to laugh when I picked up a boss's sledgehammer mid-fight, went over my inventory limit, and then immediately got killed because I wasn't allowed to dash or sprint anymore. Let's see how Deus Ex handles inventory space. You're limited by the number of slots you have, and this number is small enough that you need to make genuine trade-offs when deciding what's worth carrying. Weapons take up the most space, but hacking tools, lockpicks, and healing items aren't free either, and sooner or later you'll need to make the call about what to carry. These limited resources also mean that the player has a great reason to explore and look around, in the hopes that they'll find more. What does Cyberpunk give you in return for checking every box and container? An inventory full of worthless crap that periodically forces you to pause the game and flush it out. Now that I think about it, this inventory system really is something like the gaming equivalent of having to go to the bathroom every few hours to deal with the pulpy waste products of this game's shit-filled resource economy. The conclusion I'm drawn to here is that inventory limits work in a linear level-based game, but they make absolutely no sense in an open world. And I mean, I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but that's the theme I keep coming back to, isn't it? My inclusion of Cyberpunk in the immersive sim genre is intended as a compliment, and when those elements are allowed to shine, it can be really enjoyable to play. But that comparison also makes glaringly obvious the fundamental flaws sitting right at the heart of this game. Just like Elden Ring, the formula that Cyberpunk is trying to pull off in an open world is completely broken by the open world. Thief and Deus Ex work because they take place in finite worlds with finite amounts of resources. When your choices actually cost you something, you feel the weight of every decision and are always aware of scarcity. In the open and infinite world of Cyberpunk, you can never truly run out of anything. You just wait until it recharges. In other words, while you have a good degree of control over equipping your character and customizing your moveset, there are very few meaningful decisions to be made in the minute-to-minute gameplay, because there are never, ever any consequences in terms of resources. And so now seems like a good time to shift my discussion over to the open world itself, and let loose my complaints about the many problems it introduces to the game. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of Cyberpunk's flaws, even in the enclosed mission environments, can be traced back to the open world structure, but believe me when I say there's enough still to cover that I can do so without repeating myself. Things are about to get a lot more negative, so I want to offer a quick reminder that Cyberpunk isn't a bad game, and I played it to the end because the good parts were enough to carry me through. But Cyberpunk is also a game that falls far, far short of the potential offered by its premise, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't hold it to account for that. Grab yourself a bowl of scop and buckle up. On the edge of Night City there's a giant mound of garbage, the refuse and detritus of the late 21st century disposable lifestyle piled up and left to rot in the California sun. It seems like a nice touch of thoughtful world building, of the type you don't see very often, and its presence has some relevance for the story too, as your character is executed and left here to decompose near the beginning of the game. But I find myself wondering, did the devs include this junkyard because it made sense for the setting and then let it fit naturally into the story? Or did they write the set piece into the story and then have to design the location and add it to the world later? This question may seem like an academic one, but I think it's worth paying attention to. And what's more, I'm pretty sure I know the answer. If I tell you that I can't recall a single other example of a character mentioning disposing of a body here, or disposing of a body at all for that matter, then I think you'll start to get a sense for how contrived and unnatural its inclusion can feel. Somewhat ironically, this junkyard environment is itself single-use and disposable. That idea of disposability is something I want to zone in on and return to in this section, but to get this party started, let me just come out the gate with my main criticism of Cyberpunk's open world, and what is in my opinion the smoking gun that proves its utter pointlessness. This open world is not one big level for the player to interact with and have experiences in. What it is a torturous and over-elaborate 3-dimensional menu for selecting between levels, a menu that takes several minutes to navigate while providing absolutely nothing in the way of interesting choices or interactions. It also entails a hell of a lot of actual menu usage, which kills the flow of the game and gets tiresome very quickly. Let's say you've just finished a side mission and want to get started on another one. First, you have to open the map, choose which one you want to do next, and drop a waypoint on it. Then, you have to open a different menu and decide which vehicle you want to magically spawn just off screen. Then you get in your vehicle and hold accelerate for a few minutes while you stare at the corner of the screen to see when you should turn left or right. Because the minimap only shows you the way to the destination you've selected and nothing else, you won't be distracted from the very simple goal of getting there, and you'll have no decisions to make unless you don't like the radio station and want to hear something else. The only choice you make throughout all of this process is picking which mission you want to do next. Everything else is just time-wasting busy work. When you arrive at your destination, for all intents and purposes you've travelled between two small islands of content entirely disconnected from each other, and the actual gameplay is able to resume. This is all assuming, of course, that you don't make use of fast travel. If you do, then it's even more painfully obvious that you're essentially just using a mission select menu, but with more steps. When you become aware that you're being forced to pay a travel tax in between missions before you're allowed to play the actual game, you have to start questioning, what's the point of it all? Just look at this footage and tell me with a straight face that this drive through empty streets is adding something worthwhile to my experience. You might be tempted to say that the open world contributes to the immersive sim elements by facilitating more freedom in side missions. That is, by giving the player more options in how to approach a location. Sure enough, there's almost always more than one route in or out of a mission area, with one or more of them usually requiring some kind of investment in a skill or ability to make use of, but there's nothing that couldn't also have been achieved in a level-based game with no open world. It all depends on where you draw the boundaries. I might also add that the player is almost never expected to come back to a location more than once. So again, I have to ask, what is the open world accomplishing that couldn't be achieved with a level-based approach? The reality is that there are very, very, very few missions that actually have part of them take place in the open world, so the overwhelmingly vast majority of the time the player spends outside is in that transitory menu-like state between missions. The pointlessness of it all really comes into focus when you're heading to a destination in the Badlands outside Night City, and you truly are just going in a straight line through an empty environment. Imagine if Deus Ex made you select the next level from a menu, and then made you spend 5 minutes holding W on your keyboard moving through a huge empty space, and I hope you'll agree just how absurd this really is from a gameplay perspective, and how little of value it contributes to the game.
You have a single fact to back that up?
The principal argument I anticipate in defense of the open world is that it provides a believable and consistent backdrop so that the player can more easily immerse themselves into the cyberpunk fantasy without interruption. Never mind that the map and various other menus are constantly interrupting you as you play. To counter this argument, I would submit that this game's portrayal of Night City is not an especially immersive environment. Pedestrians don't move out of the way when you're driving towards them beeping your horn. Vehicles spawn off screen when you summon them and magically repair themselves. The only actions that police will ever respond to is harming pedestrians, and they'll lose interest 20 seconds later with zero consequences for the player. Club scenes consist of a sad dance floor with a scattering of people doing a handful of animation loops. And all of this is assuming the game is working as intended and not glitching out. But worst of all, in this open world, there's simply nothing to do. Every single interactable event is signposted on the map with a marker, so there's nothing to organically discover, and every mission takes place in its little self-contained level, totally separate from the rest of the map. If the purpose of an open world is to give players the chance to get lost and immersed in an environment that feels real, then what are you left with when it doesn't? Honestly, I think I could rest my case here and have sufficiently demonstrated why Cyberpunk's open world adds nothing to the experience. But of course, I'm not done moaning yet, because this open world virus infects the rest of the gameplay until even the good parts are tainted by it, some of which I brought up already in the previous section. In short, because the devs need the open world to remain a static and unchanging space throughout an entire playthrough, this consequence-free nature bleeds into the immersive sim elements too, which cheapens them and makes them throwaway, and, wait for it, disposable. There we go, I told you that word would be coming back. An example that I've already given is the RAM used by the player for hacking. While using one of your limited hacking tools in Deus Ex constitutes a meaningful choice that's not to be taken lightly, the infinitely recharging RAM in Cyberpunk can be used carelessly and without consequences, and I think the game's open world structure is directly to blame for this. In an endless open world, there is no such thing as a limited resource, only resources that take more or less time to farm. And don't get me wrong here, obviously the devs picked the lesser of two evils by making RAM recharge automatically rather than requiring the use of a farmed consumable. But the root of those two evils is the infinite nature of the open world. If the game was linear and level-based, resources would actually be limited and there would be actual choices to make about how to use them. Here's another element of the game that ends up being disposable: the player's vehicles. Whenever you finish a mission indoors and make it back outside, there's no guarantee your car will still be waiting where you left it, and in some particularly egregious cases, if you park it in the wrong spot, it will disappear right in front of your eyes to make room for a scripted vehicle that's supposed to show up. Now, I'm not complaining about this being unrealistic, though it obviously is. I'm complaining that it contributes to the meaningless, throwaway nature of almost every element of this game. You don't need to treat anything with care or worry about consequences. You can just bring up a menu and your car will reappear right behind you, good as new. Vehicles, healing items, RAM, optical camo, even grenades, all of these things are infinitely rechargeable or respawnable, and because they cost you nothing, that means they're also worth nothing to you. They're toys to be disposed of whenever the player, or whenever the game, feels like doing so. Another symptom of Cyberpunk's open world sickness are the waypoints and markers that plague every mission and refuse to let the player have the satisfaction of working things out for themselves. I find this to be an incredibly lazy, not to mention boring, way of telling the player where to go. Just look at this example. In this side quest with the companion character River, you're given the objective of finding a way inside the lab, which sounds like an interesting open-ended problem that the player can exercise some freedom and ingenuity in solving. But in the very same breath, the game plasters a waypoint on the screen that tells you where to go. I trust that not much explanation is needed on why I have a big problem with this. Just play Thief for 10 minutes to see the immersive benefits of letting the player figure out how to navigate for themselves. I could give countless examples of Cyberpunk getting this wrong, but here are just a few. A map marker shows you exactly where to find an employee badge to get you into a restricted area. When attempting to break into a club, markers give away the different options you have for doing so. Here's a similar situation in a club in Dogtown, with waypoints giving the game away. And don't tell me that I should just open the settings and turn these markers and waypoints off, because if you do that, then the game becomes unplayable, since these markers are often the only way the devs tell you which items you're supposed to interact with to progress missions and story moments. And while I'm on the subject of interactivity and readability, look at this room from early in Deus Ex, where almost every object can be interacted with in some way, and compare that to any modern game of your choosing. Now, what I'm about to say may seem to have an obvious answer, but just stop and really think about it for a second. Why would a game developer include objects in their game that can't be interacted with? Somewhere in the last 25 years, we've taken a wrong turn. Playing and critiquing Cyberpunk has really helped to crystallize for me the thing that I dislike most about open world games. The philosophy of the genre today seems to be that the player should be free to do everything, see everything, unlock everything in a single playthrough, and that they can take as long as they like to do so. There's never any penalty for delaying the main story or wasting time, There are no consequences for anything the player does, and there's an infinite amount of every resource waiting to be found somewhere if the player is patient enough, meaning that no action the player can perform ever really costs them anything. There's simply no way a system like the limited lockpicks or hacking tools from Deus Ex could work in an open world because the player would be able to find a way to farm them. We saw a similar problem in Tears of the Kingdom too. Because the player has an enormous inventory containing every item they've ever picked up, the game is incapable of actually presenting an interesting challenge that can't be beaten by opening a menu and spawning a pre-made solution. In an open world game, nothing you do matters. Nothing you do can really affect anything other than the story, and that can only occur in very limited, predefined ways scripted by the writers and developers. To coin an analogy, consider the difference between a TV sitcom and an ongoing series that actually has a developing story to tell. In a sitcom, the characters might have a short adventure with a few twists and turns, but everything always returns to normal by the end of the episode. This is what it's like playing an open world game. You have your little escapade, and there might even be a cameo from a main character if it's a story mission, but then everyone disappears again and it's back to business as usual, roaming around Night City without a care in the world. To take an obvious example from the game, one mission ends with V and their ally Takemura kidnapping Hanako, the sister of Yorinobu Arasaka, head of the Arasaka Corporation and one of the most powerful men on the planet, who all logic dictates should have the resources to track you down and make your life difficult and short. And yet, the player can take as long as they want doing side quests and otherwise killing time before heading to the mission marker where Hanako is being held to advance the story, at which point Arasaka goons will show up with incredibly convenient timing to create a limp and predictable set piece. Now imagine for a second if the actions the player performed during missions actually had some kind of effect on the open world that's supposed to be an immersive and believable environment. Crazy idea, I know. With a vengeful Arasaka on the lookout for V, the player would have to be mindful and keep a low profile as they made their way towards the hideout where Hanako was being held. To return to my TV analogy once more, this is what an open world game would look like if it was more like an ongoing series than a sitcom with throwaway plotlines. But as we all know, it's not, because the sanctity of the sandbox is not allowed to be violated by such petty things as narrative or consequences, and the end of every mission has to see the player being spat back out into the never-ending and overwrought menu that passes for an open world. There may be stakes in the story, but there are no stakes at all in the gameplay. Perhaps I don't need to remind you that the plot of Cyberpunk is quite literally about a race against time to save V's life, but the tension implied by that trope is totally absent from the gameplay. I won't be so bold as to say that adding a 2-week timer would instantly solve all of Cyberpunk's issues, but it's undeniable that something like that would give the gameplay more urgency and make the player think more carefully about how they spent their precious time in Night City. Instead, we get the same old issue of an open world trampling over the narrative and providing a constant reminder that nothing the player does is important. And just as I always do, I've slipped into the usual open world bashing. Don't I have anything original to say? Well, as I keep repeating, I think there's a huge amount of potential in Cyberpunk's premise, and if the open world had been approached differently, I could see it being a worthwhile inclusion. If the whole of Night City really was one big level, where choice and consequence actually mattered, like one of the smaller levels expanded into a much bigger size, then I'd be speaking a lot more positively about it right now. Instead of every mission and side gig taking place in a small, self-contained area, what if your actions in one mission affected your relationship with the various factions in the world? The sky really is the limit in the ways the devs could have explored this. Maybe killing gangoons rather than using non-lethal methods would cause a faction to dislike you more, barring you entry to chop shops in their district or raising security on their other outposts to make future missions more difficult. What if getting caught breaking in somewhere led to gang members calling in reinforcements from another location? Maybe you could even use this to your advantage by causing a distraction at one site before moving on to a more weakly defended target. Something like the random encounters from Red Dead 2 might have filled the void while travelling too, although with the higher speed of cars compared to horses, it would be harder to get the player to stop and notice them. But again, the possibilities here are pretty much endless, and I'm not trying to claim these ideas in particular are amazing. They're simply something instead of nothing. I realise that these hypothetical suggestions would require some fairly complex systems to be built on top of everything else the game already has going on, and I'm well aware that this would be no small feat in terms of development. but the reality is that without any systems like this for the player to actually interact with, the open world of Cyberpunk is barren, lifeless, and ultimately without purpose, meaning that in our real, non-hypothetical universe, several years of talented development time were wasted on designing a shiny-looking space empty of anything to do. It brings me no pleasure to say that, but that's the conclusion that my experience with Cyberpunk leads me to. To really drive home this point on missed potential, I want to start wrapping things up with a brief summary of my experience with the DLC, Phantom Liberty, near the end of my playthrough. The intro to this content initially, and I think deliberately, raised my expectations and made me believe that the game was actually going to give some purpose to Dogtown, the small new self-contained area added by the DLC, but it wasn't long before my hopes were dashed against an Idris Elba-shaped rock. The first few scenes of Phantom Liberty are quite clearly setting up an Escape from New York style infiltration mission to rescue the President after her plane is shot down over Dogtown.
President of what?
That's not funny, Pliskin.
This intro immediately got my imagination fired up. I thought I was going to be dropped into a big hostile environment encompassing the whole of Dogtown, and asked to accomplish my goals by whatever means necessary to me. A small open world functioning as one continuous level capable of reacting to the player's choices and making their actions feel consequential is a very compelling idea, and in my opinion this is the only potential feature of open worlds worth caring about. If the DLC had looked like this, it would have helped to solve a lot of the problems I have with the open world that I've just spent this entire section of the video moaning about. But, as I'm sure you've worked out by now, the DLC does not look like this. The closest it ever comes to it is in the first hour or so, when the player escorts the President across a hostile Dogtown, which, incidentally, I think is the only time in the entire game where the player is asked to treat the overworld as part of the Immersive Sim and do some stealthing and/or shooting in an open environment. Just pointing that out. Immediately after this intro is over, the gates to Dogtown are thrown wide open, and you can come and go as you please. It becomes folded into the rest of the open world, complete with its own fast travel points for when you just don't feel like going through this checkpoint for the 20th time. Every remaining mission of the DLC takes place in its own self-contained location, and the concept teased in the beginning is dropped completely. In other words, Dogtown becomes just another district of Night City, with the same disposability and lack of consequences as everywhere else. You can even summon your vehicles in Dogtown just like you do outside, which doesn't really make any sense at all, but at this point who gives a shit about consistency? I think the devs realised that the open world of the base game was empty and dull, because it seems like an attempt was made to introduce some more interesting things for the player to do while roaming around Dogtown, but I think they were reaching in the wrong direction with their ideas here. There are occasionally airdrops that will land near the player in Dogtown and cause two factions to start fighting over them. All pre-scripted, of course, because spontaneity is illegal in 2077. The first time I saw this happen, I found it worth engaging with simply for the unique scenario it presented. The second time, I realised that it was more or less identical to the first. The third time, I just ignored it. In a similar vein, the DLC adds car theft side gigs that occasionally appear in your minimap, but once you've seen two of these, you've seen them all. These missions are extremely dull, the destination is always way too far away, and the twists thrown in like being chased by rivals or having to beat a timer for some reason are just annoying. Now that I think about it, I'm not sure I ever really enjoyed the driving in Cyberpunk, but it's not worth getting into that now. And that's it. These two kinds of pseudo-random encounter are the DLC's answer to the tedium of the base game's open world, and they're simply not enough to fill the gaping void. There are no interesting choices to be made in engaging with these events. If you've designed a game where the player's decision-making is primarily influenced by how bored they are of the repetitive content, you're in a ludic dead end, and you need to double back. One idea in the DLC that I think has a lot more potential is the gang hideouts that the player can infiltrate for a substantial slice of Immersive Sim gameplay. The reason I would count these separately to the usual self-contained side gigs present in Dogtown is that they're not contingent on an NPC giving you a side quest and putting a marker on your map. The player is capable of breaking in at any time to reach the boss at the end and loot their spoils. Unfortunately, there's no way for the player to figure out the location of these hideouts for themselves by, say, interrogating lower level enforcers and working their way up the chain, or tracing the supply of illegal goods back to their origin. Instead, the locations are revealed when the player picks up a single easily missable text pickup in the basement of a main story location that you will visit exactly twice, which is absolutely insane to me. As far as I'm concerned, this is incontestable proof that some more elaborate features regarding Dogtown's open world had to be cut down at some point in development. Given the entire game's tumultuous development, I have to wonder how many good ideas ended up on the cutting room floor as the team's initial ambitions came into contact with reality, and they realised they were going to have to delay release, and then delay again, and then make some difficult decisions about what features to prioritise and what to let go. And would you look at that, suddenly I find myself with the perfect segue into a discussion of bugs and glitches, which is the final topic I'll discuss before moving into my conclusion. I didn't see anywhere near the amount of bugs as were all over the internet at launch, but I did get the odd hiccup, most notably a frame rate crunch whenever I transitioned into a close-up dialogue scene or opened the map, which was unfortunately a bit too often to be ignored and forgiven. The only show-stopping problem I encountered was when an NPC was driving me somewhere and ended up going round in circles forever. This happened twice in my playthrough. Both times I waited for around 5 or 6 minutes with no dialogue or music until deciding it was going nowhere and reloading an autosave. But at least I got a laugh out of the fact that our car was crashing into everything on the road. Aside from the obvious blow it deals to immersion, the biggest problem caused by the game's reputation for being buggy is that when something unexpected happens, the player never feels quite sure if it's a glitch or if it was intended, and this remains true regardless of how much patching the devs have done since release. When I was chasing after this self-driving car for a side mission and it suddenly stopped, I thought something had gone wrong and had accidentally passed through a trigger for a different quest to start with the people nearby. Eventually the dialogue caught up to what was happening and I realised that this was an intentional part of the same job. For a more innocuous example, when I noticed that my pistol ammo counter had gone above 100,000 despite normally being capped at 999, I had a chuckle and wondered how that glitch could have happened. It was only hours later I realised that this was due to a property of the pistol I had equipped, which used up money instead of ammunition, so in fact the game was working exactly as intended. But I think you see my point here. The game's shoddy performance in other areas, and especially at release, had primed me to write off anything unexpected as nothing more than a bug, and that was where my mind went first in every case. To put it another way, the trust I should have had in the game to provide me with a consistently believable experience was shattered, perhaps before I even started playing, and there was absolutely nothing it could do to win me back. The fact that the devs managed to get the game mostly fixed and working 3 years after release has earned them some praise and goodwill, rather than being taken as the bare minimum that it is. Still, I do feel some sympathy for the position they must have found themselves in 2020, several years into a multi-year project that was nowhere near finished and having no choice but to release something and make some money so that the developers could continue to eat dinner. The whole sorry affair can be taken as further evidence of the total unsustainability of the AAA games industry, and as I've said elsewhere, I think it's only a matter of time until this bubble pops. So how can I best summarise and conclude my feelings about Cyberpunk? On the positive side, there are plenty of good ideas in the immersive sim elements of the game, and I consistently enjoyed devising my own solutions to problems using the particular skill set I chose to equip myself with. The freedom available to the player here is more pronounced in the optional side missions than in the more linear main ones, which hold your hand a little too tightly and don't give as much room for improvisation. This is less than ideal since the freedom to make choices and experience their consequences is one of the main draws of immersive sims to begin with, but I'm willing to let that go as a certain amount of linearity and railroading is necessary for the game to have a coherent story. What I can't let go, and what really drags every other element of this game down, is, of course, the open world structure. Cyberpunk's lifeless open world completely fails to justify its own existence, and I mean it when I say that its inclusion actively makes everything else worse, with most of the problems stemming from the fact that the open design makes the game world and everything in it infinite. Almost every single resource is made worthless and ultimately meaningless to the player. Inventory management is a pointless chore that never presents the player with an interesting question to answer. The story loses all sense of tension and is totally lacking in consequences. Waypoints and markers are constantly plastered over the screen to keep the player informed on which locations are worthy of their attention, which is only necessary because 99% of them aren't. Many of these complaints can be levelled at any other open world game as well, and if you want to, you can consider this conclusion an attack on the genre as a whole, at least in its current incarnation. I've made no secret of my distaste for open worlds, and I won't be sad to see them eventually fade out of fashion as time marches onwards. but I'm not so narrow-minded as to say that there's nothing worth learning from various developers' experiments with the genre throughout the years. As I see it, the biggest potential benefit that open worlds bring to the table is a sense of immersion and continuity, the feeling that everything the player does takes place in the same world and has some effect on it. Cultivating this feeling is a noble goal, and I greatly respect any attempt at it, but it's very, very hard to do it right, and once the illusion breaks, it's broken for good. Red Dead 2 just about gets away with it because so much of it is spent alone in the wilderness. When you do come across an NPC, it often feels like a noteworthy event, and it usually presents a scenario that the player is free to get involved in multiple different ways. Narrow interactions with NPCs feel natural and believable when they're simply strangers met by chance on a lonely road. But these limited interactions crumble completely and veer dangerously into cringe territory when they're used to portray a relationship between two characters who are supposed to be close to each other. Leaving aside improvements in graphical fidelity, which will always be an unwinnable arms race, the element of immersion that I hope to see future open-world developers lean into is that feeling of the world reacting to and showing the consequences of the player's choices. To that end, I think that smaller open worlds are the way to go, which will have the added benefit of removing the massive amount of empty time-wasting space present in big open worlds today. Imagine a small but densely complex environment with multiple different factions and characters for the player to interact and build relationships with. Friendly factions could help you towards your goals, hostile ones could hinder you, with the player's actions affecting these relationships and therefore actually feeling significant. This smaller environment would be like one continuous level that the player could have consistently meaningful interactions with, instead of a big empty 3D menu. I'm pretty sure that CD Projekt originally intended to do something like this with Dogtown in Cyberpunk's DLC, then chickened out when they realised how much work it would be and just copied over the structure of the rest of the game. I suppose I shouldn't be too surprised by that, but I am disappointed. Ultimately, in terms of providing an engaging open world, Red Dead 2 easily takes the cake from Cyberpunk, and when it comes to being a good immersive sim, Deus Ex still stands head and shoulders above every competitor. In its attempt to combine the two genres, Cyberpunk brings over all the worst trends of open world design and ends up landing in a messy pile somewhere in the middle. But the concept of an immersive sim that all takes place in a single continuous space remains an infinitely compelling one, and the potential it would have for deeply emergent systems speaks for itself. I hope to one day play a game that pulls off that concept, because Cyberpunk does not.